So the subject of today's lecture is nonviolence. But before I get to that subject, I want to just say a few concluding things regarding the Holocaust. And as I've mentioned to you before, we're not having a discussion in this class on the entire course of World War II. Because that's obviously a massive subject in itself, and we're not interested in some of that kind of, particularly military history. And as I pointed out to you on Wednesday, the consequences and implications, the aftermath of World War II, that's more or less what we're going to be looking at when we look at the Cold War, when we look at the whole ideology of development, the idea of the modern nation-state system, the United Nations, and all of that. So all of that is going to come in the aftermath of World War II. But I do want to say a couple of things about resistance, Jewish resistance in World War II. This is a subject that's controversial is not quite the word. There are differing views on this matter. The view that prevailed for a very long period of time was the view that on the whole, if one looked at the history of the Jews, particularly in Germany, it would be very difficult to point to a concerted history of resistance. The argument that has been put forward is that it was virtually impossible for the Jews to offer resistance given the nature of the totalitarian regime. In Germany, there were obviously isolated instances of that, and we know that there was more than one assassination attempt on Hitler himself, although I don't think that that's the best way to really think about the history of resistance among the Jews in Germany. I think that or elsewhere in Europe, where obviously there had been a history of anti-Semitism, and in fact in countries like France, the history of anti-Semitism is a much more sustained history than in Germany itself, and obviously in places such as Poland and Hungary, that is in Eastern Europe. What I think is interesting here is, and the reason this is a segue to the next segment is because I'm going to really speak to you about the history of nonviolence and the history of nonviolent resistance. I don't believe that courses that are usually taught in contemporary world history actually ever offer any thoughts on the question of nonviolence. Usually there's a mention of Gandhi, of course. I think it's actually quite important that we look at the history of nonviolence and nonviolent resistance because if the 20th century was a history of total war, a history of war without any kind of restraint, wars that shattered all notions of limits, then what's, I think, all the more important is to understand that the 20th century was also the century that witnessed the most unusual forms of resistance, particularly nonviolent resistance. That is, that when you are in a situation that calls for a creative response, then people strive for that. So if you go back to the history of Jewish resistance in World War II, I mean, the most successful illustration of that, I should have shown you some images because I was actually in Berlin a few months ago, and I went to the very site where they had the demonstration, what's called the Rosenstrasse demonstration. And this Rosenstrasse demonstration, so I'll try to show you some slides, even though they'll be out of sequence on Monday if I can remember. But this was a demonstration waged by white German women who were married to Jewish men. Okay, so non-Jewish white German women married to Jewish men. Now, you know that when they started rounding up the Jews, which I described to you in my previous lecture, Jews who were married to a non-Jew were usually left alone in the beginning. It's only as the war dragged on and as what's called the final solution, as a final solution came into implementation, there's a kind of almost mythical account about the Wannsee Conference and that where the plot for the final solution was hatched. But of course, all of this had been going on for some period of time. But the final solution was this idea that you were going to exterminate, the very last Jew that you could. And so eventually we find that they started rounding up people, Jews who were married to non-Jews. And so what these women did, their men had been taken away, but the women themselves, of course, were non-Jewish, and they were German, they were Teutonic. So they actually stood outside the SS headquarters, the Gestapo headquarters in Berlin, many of them, and just stood there day after day. It was a wordless protest in a way, and it became larger, and it became an acute embarrassment. And in fact, it is probably one of the very few demonstrations that actually produced results, because these men were released. Their Jewish husbands were released. Right? So that's what's one illustration. Of course, the most well-known instance of Jewish resistance was what's called the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And the photograph that you're seeing here, not a very good photograph really, but if you look at it carefully, this is the Warsaw Ghetto after it had been razed to the ground. The Warsaw Ghetto was where they had, of course, eventually brought in all the Jews, in the proximity of Warsaw in Poland, and it was the largest such ghetto, the most well-known, generated a life of its own, but eventually they razed the ghetto because they had an uprising there. There is a man whose obituary I wrote. I never met him, but I had read his work, and I wrote his obituary, Marek Edelman, and he was a deputy commander of the Warsaw Ghetto when the uprising took place. He just died about 8 or 10 years ago. And one of the most striking things is that, since he lived on for a very long period of time, he is one of the few Jews in such a prominent position, that is a great resistance fighter and all of that, who refused to emigrate to Israel. He continued to live on in Poland. One of the things that he said was that, people have mythologized and romanticized the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Yes, it was a heroic struggle, but in a sense, it was doomed right from the very outset, because there were very few of us. And we were against this machinery of death, right? So you do have instances of that kind, and then one, of course, has to have some kind of grip on how exactly one is going to assess the history of such resistance. And finally, I should say that those who argue that, well, nonviolent resistance could never have worked in Germany because the Jews, who in any case were killed in such huge numbers that they would have been completely crushed. The only thing I would say in response to that is that you do not start a nonviolent campaign at the end of the day. You started much before, right? That is one of the things that I think that if there had been a concerted campaign of nonviolent resistance among the Jews in Germany, I think this is something that would have had to begun in the early 1930s. In the early 1930s, maybe mid-1930s at the latest, but you cannot, in the midst of 1942 or 43, say, well, nonviolent resistance can't work. Right? Nonviolent resistance is not simply a matter of few people coming up and saying we're not going to use arms. There is an entire theory and practice of nonviolence. All right? Now, let me then move to the subject of nonviolence in history. And I think it's the most striking thing that you have to think about is twofold. One, that for every 100 books that have been written on violence, maybe there's one book on nonviolence. Right? That is that there is a kind of a morbid fascination that we have for the subject of violence. Because, of course, when we look at violence, and we recognize that there are myriad forms of violence. There are spoken forms of violence and unspoken forms of violence. The things that we have seen, genocide, extermination, colonial wars, these are obviously the most brutal, overt forms of violence. Right? But there are other forms of violence as well. If a man speaks to his spouse in a very loud tone, domineering voice all the time, well, that's a form of violence too, perhaps. We know that there's domestic violence. And that's why these phrases such as domestic violence have come into the English language as of a few decades ago. Right? And we understand that there are other forms of violence which may not even require you to raise your voice in a domineering way. And so there are myriad registers in which we can think about it. But I'm saying in totality, what is really striking is that nonviolence has never really been the subject of historical investigation as violence has been. And one reason for that is that when we think of violence, we really think about events. And history, in the most conventional way in which we understand it has always revolved around the study of events, right? So, you look at World War II, you look at World War I, you look at the Boer War, the Spanish Civil War, the Vietnam War. You look at such and such rebellion. You look at John Brown and Harper's Ferry. These are events. So the idea of event has always been a critical nodal point. And there is a huge deal of historiographic reflection on some of the difficulties of using the idea of the event as a way of organizing an understanding of history. Then there is another liability. And that liability is the word nonviolence in the English language is dependent, contingent upon violence. Because if I asked what is nonviolence, the answer would be it's the absence of violence. Right? So you first need violence. You have to think about violence, and then you say it's the absence of violence. Right? If somebody said, what is violence? Would you logically describe it as the absence of nonviolence? No one would. No one would. The negative in English makes all the difference. And in Sanskrit, it's important here to move to Sanskrit for a moment, because of course we're going to move to Gandhi momentarily, that the word for nonviolence in Sanskrit is ahimsa over here, and the a here, or a here, is again the negative. So you could say that in Sanskrit you have a similar problem. I would suggest that in fact that's not quite the case. And the reason it's not quite the case is that because the idea of ahimsa, it does not historically, in the context of Indian thought, have the same liability that that is that it is not contingent upon himsa in the same way. Himsa would be violence, ahimsa is the non-violence, right? Okay? That ahimsa in fact has a life of its own, which is independent of the idea of himsa or violence. Right? But that's too philosophical a matter for us to delve into right now. This is simply to alert you to the fact that we would have to start thinking about what we understand by nonviolence. Because I want to suggest to you that nonviolence simply cannot be seen as the absence of violence. If that was the case, then right now all of us seated in this room, right, are in some ways practicing nonviolence. We're being nonviolent, right? And that would be, of course, by far the weakest conception that one could think of the idea of nonviolence. Now, there's also the question about whether it's different from passive resistance. I mean, the greatest exponent of the idea of nonviolence in history, namely Mohandas Gandhi, right, was in fact emphatically firm in thinking that, yes, there is a considerable difference between nonviolence and passive resistance. And part of that difference is precisely this, that nonviolence is an active force, right? It's an active force. When you exercise nonviolence, you bring a force to bear upon the object of your action, the object of your inquiry. And it is not an accident that the word that Gandhi coined for his idea of non-violent resistance is satyagraha, right? I'm going to highlight that word later on for you. Satyagraha, and satyagraha means what? It means satya is truth, agraha is force, the force of truth, right? That's what he called his idea of non-violent resistance. And there are, again, complicated questions here because, for example, for those of you who are familiar with the biblical tradition, even remotely, let's say you haven't read the Old Testament because, it puts everyone to sleep. He begat, he begat, everyone keep on begatting, right? No, I mean, if you read Matthew 5-7 Sermon on the Mount, for example, we find that that's a text that has been critically important for traditions of nonviolence, at least in the Christian tradition. The Quakers, the Mennonites would be two groups that have paid very close attention to passages from the Sermon on the Mount. Right? So there's another set of questions, but again, that takes us well outside the purview of this course, that is a philosophical analysis of what are some of the religious antecedents of nonviolence in Christianity and in other world religions, right? But when Jesus says, turn the other cheek, well, what does that mean, right? So that's what a scholar is going to investigate at very substantial length. To what extent was Christ, for example, a proponent of what we might describe as nonviolence? And then you can get into extraordinarily complicated questions such as, is nonviolence compatible with anger at all? When Jesus went to the temple to throw out the money changers, the dealers in Mammon, right? What was he doing? He was certainly showing his anger, and that's one of the few moments, certainly I think in the New Testament, where you can say that the anger of Christ comes across very clearly. But that itself may be read also as an instance of nonviolence, right? That is, that there are different forms of persuasion, and then we'd have to, if we were to make these very fine distinctions, we'd have to attempt to understand to what extent is nonviolence compatible with traditions of persuasion, and at what point does persuasion start to verge on coercion, right? And so on. You get the general idea that there is a set of philosophical, ethical questions that we would have to think about if we start looking at nonviolence in history. Now, in introducing Gandhi, what I also have to do is to look at some of the more immediate antecedents and also understand in what respect Gandhi was actually fundamentally different. And I want to turn my attention here to one American we have looked at before. I want to look at him in a different context now, and that's Henry David Thoreau. You know that Henry David Thoreau spent 1 day in jail, not a very long period of time. He was bailed out by his friend and Ralph Waldo Emerson and others in the community. So Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson are two major 19th century American writers, founders of a movement that comes to be known as American Transcendentalism. And if you look at the essay that Thoreau wrote, so what was the occasion for writing the essay? He was hauled into jail. You know, he lived in New England, in Concord, which is just on the outskirts of Boston. Yeah, and he was hauled into jail, and what was the occasion for hauling him into jail? That he refused to pay his taxes because he said, my taxes are used to support an illegal war. He was referring here to the war between the United States and Mexico. This is the Mexican-American War of annexation, as Henry David Thoreau saw it. And he said, I'm not going to let my taxes be used to support an illegal war. So he's hauled into jail, and that becomes the occasion for his essay on the duty of civil disobedience, on the duty of civil resistance. Now, without getting into the question of the extent to which Gandhi was familiar with this essay, when he read it, you know, that's what's called the history of ideas, when you start exploring those kinds of things, right? How do ideas percolate down? How do they get adopted? How do they get modified by other thinkers? What is critical is the following. Number one, the idea of conscience. The idea of conscience. That's what Thoreau is really speaking about. So what he's saying is that we have to distinguish between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And he's also making a second distinction, that simply because a person finds a law offensive and therefore decides that he's going to resist that law, in fact, you have a duty to resist an unjust law, right? He's very clear about that. What Thoreau is saying is that in such instances, your resistance does not signify a contempt for law as such. In fact, to the contrary, that the person who actually resists an unjust law is still bound to respect the idea of law. This is a critically important distinction, because many people think that this is simply a way that when Thoreau argues that you have to resist unjust laws, that this becomes an exercise in anarchy, or that this is an excuse for not following the law at all. Thoreau is not saying anything like that, and in fact, Mohandas Gandhi was quite clear about that as well. All right? So there is a respect for the rule of law, but you are bound to resist a particular law that happens to be unjust. All right? And what is it that tells you that a law is unjust? When your conscience tells you that such and such law is unjust. So therefore, you may have to disobey the letter of the law. You may have to follow what he calls the spirit of the law. Now, this is also important, and I'm introducing a complexity here, which is tacitly present in the text that you're reading, the essay by Thoreau. He doesn't spell it out. And what is it that is tacitly present there? The idea that your conscience also overrules the state, because what had started to happen in Europe by the mid-17th century? By the mid-17th century, the state was beginning to legislate in many, many domains of life. And if you think about it, what Thoreau is really saying is this, that we allow the state to do our moral thinking for us. Right? For example, how should one behave with respect to another person? How should one behave with respect to a person who is of a different race or a different religion? So now the law tells you you cannot discriminate against a person. You might discriminate against a person in your personal life. You might choose not to have a single black friend. You might choose not to have a single Muslim friend. The law cannot say anything about that. The law cannot tell you that you need to have Muslim friends and black friends and Indian friends and gay friends. Law cannot tell you that. Right? The law cannot make you love another person, but what it can tell you, and it can penalize you if you don't follow it, is that if you are hiring a person, you cannot discriminate against a person on the basis of their being black or gay or whatever the case may be. Right? I think that you all understand that. But what's happening here? It's not your conscience that is doing that work. It's the law that is doing that work. And what Thoreau was trying to do was he was trying to restore the place of conscience in his essay. That's what he's fundamentally trying to do. Right? Now, the limitation also is twofold. One, that Thoreau is not putting forward a platform of mass nonviolent resistance. Your conscience tells you, well, what if it happens to be the case that we know from what we have seen, the political drama unfolding in the United States right now, we know there are a great many people without a conscience in positions of power. Right? Not to mention ordinary people. We don't even know what the conscience of every person is. Right? The problem here is that Thoreau is thinking of an individual's duty to disobey a law that is unjust. But how does that translate into a platform of mass nonviolent resistance? Right? And of course, you could say that, well, you need to begin with the idea of conscience, and then what a leader will do is will mobilize everyone's conscience in certain ways if they can. Right? But Thoreau certainly never had any kind of idea of organized mass nonviolent resistance. It's present nowhere in that essay. Nor was he thinking about nonviolence as a mode of being. That it's not simply a question of resistance. Nonviolence is going to be, at least for someone like Gandhi, a way of being in this world. All right? And we will see illustrations of that later on. Now, the other antecedent that we need to think about is Leo Tolstoy. You know Tolstoy, for those, I'm sure there are a few of you here who have read either War and Peace or at least seen some TV version of it, or Anna Karenina, the two great novels. And you know that Tolstoy in the second half of the 19th century was the most celebrated novelist in Europe. But later Tolstoy repudiates, long story, he repudiates everything that he's written more or less. He had an estate. He was a landlord. Where a large number of people worked on his estates. So he could also derive an income from that, and he could also afford to repudiate, some people will say, his past as a novelist. But what really happens is that if you look at the later Tolstoy, what he's going to do is he's going to turn into a radical Christian anarchist, who is also going to be a radical proponent of nonviolence. In fact, there's a very short exchange of correspondence, one of the most remarkable exchanges of correspondence in modern history, you might say, between Mohandas Gandhi and Leo Tolstoy. Right? So Tolstoy is going to write a book called The Kingdom of God is Within You, where he's, in a sense, again, arguing for the individual conscience, but what he's also putting forward is a platform where he's critiquing institutionalized Christianity. So if I had to very simplify, I would say that he makes a distinction between what he calls the teachings of Jesus and institutionalized history of Christianity, the church. He thought that the church had almost nothing to say which could tell you about the teachings of Jesus Christ, right? And what he's an advocate of is a kind of, you might describe as a kind of an anarchic nonviolence, the decentralization of authority, the devolution of power, because he saw the state as an agent really fundamentally of oppression, that the state always centralizes power. And so what he is in favor of is what you might describe as organic communities. One of the communities that he supports is a group of people known as the Doukhobors. And one of the blog essays that I had asked you to read by me is an essay which I wrote on the Doukhobors, prompted also by the debates that have been taking place in the United States, such as they are called, on gun control. Right? So who are the Doukhobors? So the Doukhobors, it's a 17th century Russian mystical evangelical group that had been subjected to repeated persecutions from about the late 1600s. The Doukhobors reject all forms of external authority, including the Bible. Of course, you could ask yourself, what made them Christians at all, if they reject the Bible at all? It's not that they reject the Bible; they reject it as an infallible source of authority. Right? That there may be things that are said, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, which they may say are completely unacceptable. And in all those instances, our individual conscience will rule supreme. They also view their own leader as a reincarnation of Christ. So there is this kind of millenarianism, again, this idea of a Messiah and all of that you find in millenarian movements. And remember why I've gotten on to Doukhobors, because Tolstoy was one of the great supporters of this radical, non-violent, anarchist, mystical group, right? So what are the essential elements of their ideology? Non-violence, vegetarianism, and again, I have to point out that this is not to say that every Doukhobor necessarily adhered to vegetarianism, but this was certainly a strong element in their platform. The idea of communal property. So individual ownership of property is seen as the beginning of certain forms of what you might describe as evil. They are strong advocates of sexual egalitarianism, and they rejected conscription, which is, of course, exceedingly important, because when we look at the late 19th century, which is the very, very late 19th century, the last decade of the 1800s, is when their outward migration starts to take place. And you know that Russia was, recall from the previous lectures, Russia was at this point in the 1890s under the rule of the Tsar. You're talking about a highly autocratic regime, and of course there was conscription. A person could be called to serve in the army. They start to arrive in Canada in the late 1890s, early 1900s, and eventually the largest Doukhobor population you have today. Doukhobors are also called spirit wrestlers. Spirit wrestlers. So you have to wrestle with your own spirit, right? Okay. They start to arrive there in the late 1890s and early 1900s with financial assistance given to them by English Quakers and by Tolstoy. And two of the things that they're most noted for is, and this is something that they symbolically carry out every year in every Doukhobor community in the world today, the symbolic bonfire of guns. So if you look at this here, so this is a photograph from one such gathering where you can see the guns over here, of course, they basically round up all the guns, and then they have a bonfire of these guns. Would be lovely to have the NRA, examine some of these propositions, right? And that was what prompted, of course, my investigation of the Doukhobors. Is a very radical way of looking at the culture of guns here. And this is something that they carry out every year. The other thing that they are known for is that they strip themselves and they march naked. They march naked. Now, I want to pause for a few minutes to think about the idea of nakedness in history. All right, so let me first of all, so this is a photograph which shows the Doukhobors, both men and women. And when I say naked, I mean naked. I'm not, right? They'll come out in force, and again, this is a symbolic demonstration that they carry out in some of their communities down to the present day, although this photograph dates back to the early part of the 20th century. Because, of course, we'd have to reflect on what exactly is meant by such a demonstration. All right? What are the circumstances under which one carries out? But before I do that, look at this here. Now, I think you recall this earlier photograph, right? These are some of the men who were found at Mauthausen, which is one of the concentration camps. Ironically, by the way, when I showed you this photograph on Wednesday, I showed it to you on Wednesday, so these were the Jewish inmates of the camp. That very evening, I discovered a film which I recommend to you, which is on Netflix. It's just arrived on Netflix. It's called The Photographer of Mauthausen. All right? So it's about the concentration camp and about a man who was able to take a huge number of photographs. For all I know, this photograph might actually have been taken by him, and he had to hide these photographs. So he was one of the people who was interned in the camp. He was Spanish, and he was interned in the camp. He survived his period of internment in the camp. And we have a huge stock of photographs by him. So this is a feature film based really on his life and on his photographs. But when you see these two photographs together, right, you have to really contemplate on how we could begin to think about nakedness as we think about other tropes as a motive force, as a way to think through certain kinds of issues. Because, of course, here you see this nakedness in a very different way in the top photograph. These are people who are confident, right? Who are going out, who have stripped themselves voluntarily. At the bottom, you see the force of humiliation. What happens when you are stripped and rendered naked? Two groups of people, both naked, signifying very different relationship to the body and, of course, to the power that you have over the expression of yourself, right? And then, if you think about nakedness in history, what might be some of the consideration? Then this is important, because when we turn to Gandhi, one of the things that Gandhi always said was, I want to reduce my life to zero. I want to become naked, right? To become naked is to, of course, also a way of saying, I want the naked truth. The truth in its most unvarnished form, right? If one were to do a much longer analysis, one would also have to, of course, look at the history of representation of nakedness, right? We would also have to look at the relationship between the naked body and the clothed body. And this is one of those thousands of subjects that we are not able to address, such as, for example, what is the history of clothing in modern times, leading to, of course, also such things as fashion, because that was certainly not, for example, a consideration in the way in which it is today. We know that people who are designers of gowns and all of that, for example, these are celebrity figures in modern culture, have been for the last few decades. Right? So we can take it in that kind of direction too. But what we're interested in here is that we have to think about the dialectic between the naked body and the clothed body. Why is it that there have been traditions of resistance which revolve around the naked body? When Patrice Lumumba, a great figure in African history, anti-colonial resistance, was killed. So he was the leader, the first leader of Free Congo. And within a year of assuming power, he was removed and brutally murdered. Right? And a few days after that, his widow went out on the streets bare-chested. Right? Bare-chested. And the commentary in the Western press was, well, look at these Africans, look what they do. No, we have to understand what she's trying to do. Is she shaming you? Is one shamed when one looks at this? You're not shamed when you look at the top photograph. Right? Because there's a different notion of agency involved in rendering oneself naked. Right? But you are here. When you look at this photograph at the bottom of these prisoners, one must feel a certain sense of extraordinary shame and weakness. And think to oneself, how could one be reduced by others to such a state? Right? And so, when we think about forms of resistance, and we think about the tropes that we work through, we have to, I think, be much more imaginative. We can't write these histories in a conventional sense sometimes, all right? And now here I show you 4 photographs in juxtaposition, okay? So these 2 now you've seen. The bottom 2 you haven't seen. I don't know if anyone here recognizes the photograph on the bottom left, right? It is, I know you do. It is the most iconic photograph, perhaps, of the Vietnam War. Right? Because this is a photograph of what happened in Vietnam, in a place in Vietnam, when napalm was thrown by the Americans. And napalm, by the way, the use of napalm, which incinerates the body, right? And there's mass use of napalm by the Americans in the war. This is a continuation of killing by gas, if you ask me. And that's why I keep on saying that let's not get carried away with this idea that the Germans, are providentially the only people who are capable of that kind of evil, But what's striking here again, so now we've got multiple histories here. We've got the continuation of World War II in a way. It's a way to just start thinking about the Vietnam War. What are the Americans doing there anyhow? Right? And then, of course, it's a way of thinking about photographs. And what makes a photograph iconic? It's a way of thinking, of course, about this little girl who is going down the street, and you can see the sheer agony and the sheer bewilderment and terror on her face. And she's been stripped, right? And then you see, again, now here, Mohandas Gandhi. This is typically how he appeared, right? I mean, there's this extraordinary anecdote. It's not apocryphal either, this anecdote, right? So when he went to London in 1931 for the Round Table Conference, so the Round Table Conference was a conference called by the British to negotiate the future of Indian independence. The second Round Table Conference, September 1931. So he is invited, the arch foe of the British Empire, is invited now to have tea at Buckingham Palace with the British monarch. And as he goes up the steps of Buckingham Palace, he's more or less dressed in this fashion. And he's got a little shawl over his bare chest because it was a little cold, right? But you could still see, portions of his chest, and this is typically how he appeared. And the reporter asked him, Mr. Gandhi, do you propose going to see the king, emperor dressed in this fashion? No one goes to see the monarch dressed. And Gandhi said, I think the King Emperor is wearing enough for both of us. Fantastic, right? He's wearing enough for both of us, because you know how the British royalty, they're always overdressed, right? And the monarch, with his three-piece suit and all the medals, on his chest and everything. It's a fantastic contrast, right? But you see, we have to think about the fact that Gandhi is introducing dissent in numerous ways. This is one of the many ways in which he was introducing dissent into the standard narrative. The British didn't know what to do with someone like him at all. They were completely clueless. If he had come with a revolver, it's very easy. You shoot the bugger down, But what do you do with someone like him? Right? So that's what I put these for, because you could write a whole book around this idea of how one uses the naked body to stage a political argument, to write a narrative in a certain way. All right? Now we get to Gandhi. And, I teach an entire course on Gandhi, so what I do in 25 hours, I'm going to encapsulate in 10 minutes today for you. All right? He has many forerunners. Some of them we have seen. Tolstoy is a forerunner in a way. Thoreau in a way, Jesus Christ. There are, of course, Indian forerunners, because he came from traditions known as Jainism and Vaishnavism. Too complicated to get into really here right now, but these are, Vaishnavism is for the sake of convenience, I'm going to call it a form of Hinduism. And Jainism is another religion. It has family resemblances to Hinduism, but it's a distinct religion. And the idea of nonviolence has been critically important certainly in traditions of Jainism. Right? So, for example, the Jains have historically always been vegetarian. For them, nonviolence extends to all living beings. All living beings. The most extreme of the Jains, the Jain monks belonging to a particular sect, when they go out on the street, they carry, this is almost a cliched story, but yes, it does happen. They have a little broom with them, and they gently sweep the street in front of them before they step on it to make sure that they don't kill any ant. Right? Extreme traditions of nonviolence. The Jainism was widely prevalent in the area of India that Gandhi grew up in Western India, in the state of Gujarat. Right? And it's important to mention that because Gandhi, who was born in 1869, October 2nd, assassinated 30th January 1948, 6 months after independence of India, he grows up in this city on the coast. And again, that's where the idea of, it's not a major city, it's not Surat, it's a small town really called Porbandar, but it's looking out to the world. Right? And here we're not looking at the whole complicated trajectory of Gandhi and his biography and his education and all of that. But what is critically important are some of the ideas that he has, which are prevalent in Hind Swaraj, although Hind Swaraj, which you're reading portions of, is a text which has a great deal to say, not just about violence and nonviolence. It has a great deal to say, of course, about industrial modernity, modern civilization, right? And this word satyagraha is a word that he coins, which is satya is truth, agraha is force. So this is what he calls the force of truth, sometimes rendered into English as soul force. Really, there's no good way to render it into English as such. And his idea of nonviolent resistance of satyagraha was contingent upon a number of ideas. One is the idea of satya, of course, truth. The other is ahimsa, which I've spoken to you about, brahmacharya, which is the idea of devotion to God, celibacy, if you want to describe it that way, and sadhana, which is discipline, a certain kind of discipline that one instills upon oneself. One could even argue, although I use this phrase with some reservations, but one could argue that he was an exponent and practitioner of the idea of militant nonviolence. Militant nonviolence. by which I mean that, that nonviolence is now going to be a force, and I'm going to carry it out in a concerted fashion, right? He tests his ideas in South Africa, so to speak. Because he had gone to South Africa, Indian indentured laborers, recall Natal, 1860, right? You remember that lecture where I described the dispersal of Indian indentured labor? Gandhi does not go as an Indian indentured laborer, of course. He goes as a lawyer to South Africa, and he's going to live in South Africa for 20 years before he returns to India, just shortly after the onset of World War I. He returns in January 1915 to India, and then will only go abroad really for the Roundtable Conference. He spends the rest of his life, over 30 years in India itself. Now, in order to understand what he does, all of this, I don't have time to go over all of this. This is all detailed. These slides will be made available. You can just, if it's of any interest to you, but you won't be tested, obviously, because you don't really have the readings for it, because there are interesting questions as to how Gandhi came to acquire such prominence. There is no question that he was, for a period of time, by far the most well-known figure in world history. He was a world historical figure in various ways, right? I want to only here look just very briefly at the non-cooperation movement and salt satyagraha, because we are here on the subject of non-violence, right? Non-violence. So the non-cooperation movement is a movement that he launches in 1920. He himself terminates it in 1922, in early 1922, after an outbreak of violence in a place called Chauri Chaura. But the non-cooperation movement was a concerted way of offering resistance to colonial rule in India. And one of the things that Gandhi urged all his followers to do was to not cooperate with the British. So, for example, modern methods of striking. Now, here I don't mean a militant labor strike in the same sense, okay? A boycott of goods. So, for example, he urges Indians, do not buy any British manufactured goods. If you're trying to understand the origins, the historical origins of such things as BDS, the BDS movement now, right? You have to really go back to such movements in 1920, 21, 22 that Gandhi launched in India, the non-cooperation movement. It is very clear that he was able to effectively paralyze British administration in many parts of North India. 1930 is when he carries out a salt satyagraha. That's the last thing I'll have time to talk about today. What is a salt satyagraha? Now, Gandhi had come back in 1915 to India, I mentioned to you. By 1920, he has assumed the leadership of the Indian National Congress, right, which is a major nationalist organization. It's an organization that serves as a model to many nationalist organizations, particularly in Africa, including the ANC, the African National Congress, right? However, even though he had been there for 15 years already, at this point, independence was not on the horizon entirely. In 1930, Gandhi is thinking to himself, I need to find a way to mobilize my people, mobilize the country. So what does he do? He writes a letter to the Viceroy. The Viceroy is a person who's governing India on behalf of the British. He's the supreme representative of the British in India. He's the ruler of India. He writes a letter and he says that, look, the most common commodity in this country, a commodity that everyone has to use, is salt. And I'm going to break the salt laws. I'm going to march to the sea, and it's a march that's going to take place over 25 days. He's informing the British beforehand, this is what I propose to do, because the British had a monopoly on the production, distribution, sale of salt, right? Common everyday table salt, which provides iodine. And in a tropical country especially, you lose these salts very quickly. So he says, I'm going to violate the law. This is what I plan to do unless you are prepared to do such and such things. Now, when the British received it, they thought it was some kind of joke, frankly. Say, what does it mean for Gandhi, who, to say that I'm going to break the law and I'm going to march and you're free to arrest me? This is, what kind of theater, what kind of performance is this? Is this how the British are thinking? Well, he does exactly what he told the British he would do. They said, we're not going to do anything at all. And he goes there and he breaks the march. It makes Gandhi a world-renowned figure. That was the moment. Because when he started on the march, and so there are people who, he handpicks to accompany him, and there are others who start following him. They arrive at the sea, they break the law. They've actually technically broken the law. And within a month, they had to arrest 100,000 Indians, right? That was a demonstration of the mobilization of people to create a non-violent movement. And that's what's known as the Salt Satyagraha of 1930. All right, so we're going to stop here. In my next lecture, I'm going to briefly take up some points in Hind Swaraj and also talk to you about Martin Luther King before we move on to the segment for next Monday itself.